Welcome to the Enneagram with Chelsea and Nicoel. This is a positively deviant culture podcast anchored in the Enneagram. In this episode, we're continuing on with the type 2, talking about our very favorite episode, the paradoxes.
Every episode, I want to remind listeners that this isn't a prescriptive, fixed tool and that our conversations are designed to work with the material and the ideas in an exploratory way. So, as long as I've been working with the Enneagram, my knowledge and application continues to evolve. And that's what we're here to do, to learn together.
Yes, and the paradoxes reveal something really, really important.
This is my unique take on some essential, less visible truths about each type. It's in the paradoxes of each type where there is a trove of hidden treasures and insights into each operating system. And what I love about what this section highlights is that it exposes just how deeply we get it wrong, that we are both way worse and way better than we think we are.
This is also where the type really starts to come to life, where you start to understand, okay, this is how our strengths, when overused, become a misuse. And so let's dive into the paradoxes of the type 2.
Yeah, so some of the paradoxes of type 2 are when the selflessness becomes selfishness, where the focus on other then turns to the self and prioritizing a need that twos have that's deeply hidden about themselves and disguise of the other. The misuses of empathy, where twos can imagine what others might need and then not realizing that others actually don't need those same things. So, for an example of this, would be a two might feel cold in the environment and then assume that everyone else was equally as cold, and then be very adamant about making sure everyone had blankets or coats or whatever in order to solve that problem, because there was an inaccurate assessment of a need that was based on their imagination and sense of feeling inside their capacity for empathy that just didn't hit the mark.
And is it also based on their own needs? So you use the word disguise, which I think is really key, where it's a little different than projection. If we're unable to recognize our needs, how could we actually materialize what we truly need in the needs of others? So we can still care for ourselves, but it's like in a roundabout way, and it's through caring for others.
You nailed a very important and deep nuance for how this goes down. Twos are not in touch with their own needs, and yet they're gifted with understanding human needs. So there is this strange way, and like you said, a kind of back door where there's a place that they can take care of themselves without it feeling like they're being selfish. So twos avoid any feeling of being selfish or prioritizing themselves over others. They less consciously assume that is bad. Similarly to how eights will unintelligently judge weakness, but their definition of weakness is totally shitty. Bad definition. So twos have this definition of what it means to be selfless and giving, but it is terrible. And so they will less consciously meet their own needs by assigning it to someone else. And that's where they can maintain this feeling or sense that they're not being selfish.
Yes. Yes. And this is where martyrdom also enters the picture.
That's right. This idea of, well, I am going to prioritize the needs of others so much that I am giving over my life to that act in a way that refuses to take care of themselves. And that is martyrdom, when really no one is asking you to be a martyr and no one would want that for you. It's in this refusal to take care of themselves.
And martyrdom enter resentfulness, right? So that we're starting to touch on some of the darker places But this is truly the reality of the picture. And the goal here is to expose, as you said at the very beginning, we're much better than we believe we are as humans. And we're also far worse when we really dissect what the motivations are in some of this need to be needed becoming actually our own personal neediness.
Yes. And this is why we love this episode so much, is because it exposes some of these invisible, less measurable places that are for sure hidden to our own sight. And that's why it's so important. Here's the
Mhm.
list: attention that turns into not noticing, the ability to be helpful turns into not being helpful at all, but an actual burden, the ability to cooperate turns into control. Receptiveness, twos are gifted with being receptive, will turn into blocking. Twos' desire for peace and harmony will become codependence and strife. And their deep strength of being centered in the heart will turn into a centering on their emotional states, and they will become overly sensitive. And then this unconditional ability that they have to engage relationship and love will turn into conditional. And their exceptional ability to be thoughtful will turn into being very unthoughtful and again land in a burden for others. And then accepting will turn into rejecting. And their ability to give turns into not ability to receive.
Is there something with their desire for closeness becomes an actual pushing away of others with an over commitment to closeness?
That kind of lands in the acceptance and then rejecting. So twos are gifted with the ability to accept others and prioritize others. And that can turn into rejecting others. Twos will frame it as this person is overly dependent on me. So there becomes this paradoxical place where, to some extent, twos are creating a dependency so that that can validate that they're necessary and important to others. And then at some point, this becomes overly burdensome, and then twos will reject others because there is this dependency, and they won't see how they are the ones who created that. So that's the invisible place.
Yeah, and you struck on the need for validation, which is so critical. Verbal validation, thanking, I see you, you're needed, the help that you're providing is seen. One that you mentioned around controlling, possessiveness of I helped this person, I'm in relationship with this person, I want closeness, and that possessiveness and control of other can end up pushing people away.
The paradox of, on one hand, being very cooperative and supportive, and then in the other, being very controlling. So, what is interesting to note, and twos really expose this for most of us, is how we tend as humans to give our gifts on our own terms. And what's unique here as it sits for twos is that twos are the ones who are showing us at their best that love is not on our own terms. To love is to be in partnership, that is about a giving and receiving. And it is about this permeable place of movement. So this is why it's interesting when twos end up failing. And this is why we do the paradox episode, is because on one hand there is no better person, and yet when we miss the mark, we are the worst to miss the mark on the things that we're so incredibly gifted at. It becomes this deep hidden places of hypocrisy, but we can trace why. We can trace why. And it's just in our imperfection and our misuse of our strengths, or rejection of our strengths.
There's no bigger trigger than to want to help and be told, no, thanks. I got it. I remember one of our very first conversations, this was years ago, when I was just learning about the Enneagram and being typed as a type 2 and starting to learn about the type 2. And you proposed the simplest question. And so, for twos who are listening, if you find yourself over inserting yourself or the desire to help where there isn't a desire to be helped, asking, would it be helpful if I? And this could be in a meeting, it could be at home, it could be the simplest thing. And then over time, that being able to grow into asking yourself, not actually having to ask the other person, asking yourself. And I think this multiple times a day. It's sort of a training for myself. Would it be helpful if I were to do this thing? Because I have these instincts to help. And 9 times out of 10, that's actually not a helpful or appropriate use of that skill. And that's actually the growth. That's the course that we all have to go on is the opportunity to reflect before we act.
Yes, and specifically when we know our strengths, when we know what we're designed for, then we have to consciously leverage those strengths. And the way that we do that is by making ourselves the expert, but in a way where we have to go retrieve that expertise from ourselves. That without the attention and without the clarity, we will just react. The machine will just run itself in a more average to low functioning way. So, to get to the higher functioning places, we have to use ourselves and our strengths as the most important and valuable resource that we have to being in the world. Twos have this desire for peace and harmony, and they want everyone to get along, right? Which is a part of having a healthy and high functioning relationship, right? Which is their center. Their focus is having healthy relationships and nurturing these places of connection. So, how this turns into the paradox and turns into the opposite is when it becomes codependence and creates strife. So, it becomes the very opposite. How this happens is that twos will overvalue their role in the relationship or in the community in a way that causes them to insert themselves as the solution to the lack of harmony. But then what happens is it creates strife. That in itself, by inserting themselves into the position in a way that is codependent, creates more strife. The very effort to create harmony is what actually creates more strife. And this is really interesting. Again, a very nuanced place for how the quality and the gift that they're able to engage goes awry or goes wrong.
It also exposes the opportunity that we as twos have to really tune in to our motivations, how honest we are about what's driving those insertions, and ultimately what we get from it, which we know is the need to be needed, right? Like we're getting something from it. And that's where things start to go awry.
Exactly. The paradox for twos in relationship to the heart and emotion is when twos, of course, exist in the intelligence of the heart. How that goes wrong or opposite is when they will become oversensitive. And this oversensitivity is the misuse of these emotional places that they're gifted with. And an overinvestment or an overworking with these emotional states will create an oversensitivity. So the quality that they have is a very heightened, accurate levels of sensitivity, but that's very easy to push over the edge and to become oversensitive. And the oversensitivity is when they will be using the sensitivity in a way that makes it about themselves. The gift of sensitivity is about understanding the emotional states of humanity and others.
The oversensitivity sounds like it becomes an over identification, where if twos have this access to be this container and the container, all these emotions, remembering that they're the container holding all these emotions, not the emotions. So, in this analogy, they're the ocean, not the fish. Anything we should say about rest?
The paradox in terms of service is they're the ones who are designed to serve humanity and serve others the most brilliantly. And how that goes wrong is when they're overdoing it. So it's an overuse of their strength in a way that is depleting. And now it's no longer serving because the cost is of themselves. And part of what runs that is that twos are working to earn their value. So both twos and threes are doing this in a little bit of nuanced way, where twos, it's about lovability, and threes, it's about being valuable. But both are about value, right? Being valuable. And so twos and threes are fundamentally tied to doing and performing as a result. Twos in this way, because they're having to earn their lovability, there is an unconscious place where if they don't perform, if they're not doing, if they have not completed, if all of these things are not done, then they are not lovable or worthy or deserving. And so that is run from a very young age, right? So it becomes a habit, doing all the things that make you feel good and that don't feel good unless they're done. And the connection here is to the doing itself, is what is the mechanism that is earning your value and lovability.
And the invitation is
The invitation is that
good.
you are immensely and immeasurably loved even when you do nothing. That there is infinite value and infinite love without doing anything.
Thanks for listening. To engage or work with us, reach out via the link in our show notes and make sure to click on the follow button so you don't miss out on future episodes.